In the heart of Berlin, a battle rages on. It's a fight for homes, for communities, for the very soul of a city. But more than that, it's a testament to the enduring spirit of pushing back. Our guest today, Dr. Joanna Kusiak, stands at the forefront of a movement that has shaken the foundations of housing law in Germany's capital. Armed with a forgotten clause in the Constitution and an unwavering determination, she and her fellow activists have challenged the might of multi-billion-dollar corporations in a fight to reclaim 240,000 homes for the people. But victory, as they've learned, is rarely the end of the struggle. Despite winning a democratic referendum, the people of Berlin find themselves pushing back once again, this time against a government that seems all too willing to disregard the will of its citizens. In her book, Radically Legal, Joanna reveals a truth often overlooked in the cold halls of power: that law is not just a matter of dusty tomes and arcane arguments. It is a living, breathing thing, shaped by the hopes, fears, and grief of those it affects. This is a story that reminds us that pushing back is not a single act, but a lifelong commitment. It's a journey that demands we adapt, that we find new tools and new strengths as the challenges before us shift and evolve. From grassroots activism to legal innovation, from public referendums to the reinterpretation of centuries-old laws, the form of resistance may change, but its essence remains constant. Join us as we explore how a deep dive into legal theory became a powerful tool for social change, and how the emotions that drive us, our anger, our hope, our love for our communities, can reshape the very laws that govern our societies.
I'm Fredrik, and I'm the filmmaker.
And I'm Leilani Farha, and I'm the advocate.
And this is Pushback Talks, and we are in season 8. Crazy, isn't it? Season 8, and we all started during the pandemic when we were out touring with the film Push, where there is a main star of that film, and that's you, Leilani. But we met in London a very well-renowned academic, Saskia Sassen. You met her, and she gave her she asked you a question. Let's listen to that, the Saskia Sassen question to Leilani in London a few years ago.
You have human rights obligations,
I agree.
and you can't let these investors and the financial system run amok on its own.
I say, wow, human rights. Every single person has a bunch of rights. And then I have a question for you. And that is, are you a legal scholar on human rights? You just
Yes, that's right.
You have the instrumentality that is the law.
Exactly.
Because what I see is those with power, boy, can they deploy the law in ways that work for them. Stuff is happening, you know?
Yeah, Leilani, remember that? Stuff is happening.
I remember it. Stuff is happening.
Exactly. And I mean, your profession, you are a lawyer, and human rights is your specialty. And I know the big change when we did Push, and I could feel that the activists and the politicians around the world started to use human rights in their language, which is kind of very cool that your work kind of changed something big time. But I know you're now very engaged in what happens in Gaza and Palestine, where we have human rights law, being abused, and we have international courts saying that is what is happening might be genocide, and it's, and when I meet people say, oh, yeah, but human rights law, who cares? Is that a hopeless job you have, or is law important?
Well, yes. I mean, I think also a lot of young people are feeling like the law is, especially human rights law, is completely irrelevant. I've heard academics who are, engaged with young people all the time, professors saying that young people are really rejecting the structures, the law, the UN itself. I guess that's not my opinion, because I think what we're witnessing in Gaza is an example of what happens when you don't have the implementation of law and the rule of law. So the question is, how can we make it, for me, it's like I'm not going to abandon the law, but how do we make it effective, and how do we actually get it to be implemented?
And leads us up to our guest of this episode, and this is like an old favorite of ours, Joanna Kusiak, who is a Cambridge academic but lives in Berlin, and also an activist in the big housing battle of Berlin. Hi, Joanna. Nice to see you again.
Hello. Lovely to see you and hear you. Yeah.
You're in some very cool Berlin cafe, I can see.
Yes. You literally caught me on the go. So I was actually walking through urban space, as I heard from you. But maybe that's precisely the right place to engage with the law.
Yeah. Joanna, I mean, you've just released a book which I found really fascinating, Radical Illegal, and it's a very personal story and a fun story, because it's also a story about you and your daughter. It's also a story about brought up in Poland and with professors who were once upon a time a part of the Solidarność movement that changed Poland a lot. And then you moved to Berlin and to study the movements, but then you became an activist. I mean, it seems like it's been some intense years.
Well, nice way of recapping my life, Fredrik. Thank you very much.
but it's Berlin has been so in the lead in this struggle, in this global struggle for the right to housing. And I know Berlin, Leilani, you've been a lot to Berlin, also trying to talk with the movements and give advice and so on. Why is Berlin so important for you?
Oh, I mean, and Joanna's book, Radically Legal, really brings home why Berlin is so important. There's a huge movement in Berlin for a change to the way in which housing is being used by investors. They're deploying the law. I mean, it's like the perfect coming together and it provides hope for me as a human rights advocate focused on housing and trying to change the system, and for more importantly for other movements in Spain, in North America. People suffering on the ground are looking to Berlin and the movement that Joanna so beautifully, I mean, just huge congratulations on your book. It's just an amazing book. You bring to life what it is that's happened in Berlin and the energy, the anger and the energy that made it possible to challenge the system. So for me, Berlin is like it's the hope, but it's also a model.
Yeah, well, thank you. If I may respond to it, and if I were just to have my own 3 cents about why Berlin is important beyond Berlin, I would say that this is because Berlin takes itself seriously as a city. And you see, we started this conversation from a wing that I'm here in a nice cafe. And of course, Berlin is known for this side, right? The cafes, the hipsters, the vibrant culture. And it's very easy to dismiss it as all fun and games. But I think the unique thing about Berlin is it really takes seriously this promise of a city as a place of freedom, of diversity, and of the possibility for everyone to realize their own potential. And to take it seriously means precisely like swiftly moving from fun and games at the cafes and bars towards courthouses. And when it comes to defend this freedom, Berliners have a long tradition of mobilizing themselves in many democratic ways, both in terms of building popular movement, both movements of protest and the movements of transformation. And in a way, I think there's nothing more dangerous to a rigged system than people who take its promises seriously.
Joanna, we met in Berlin in 2019, the same day when this referendum, we got the results together, and it was a huge victory. Can you tell us about that struggle, very short recap of it?
Oh, absolutely. I do remember the evening when we met Fredrik. I think we all remember it quite vividly. So it was September 2021, the day of the general election and of our referendum. And the proposition of the referendum is to expropriate and socialize. Socialization is important because it's a proper legal term. 240,000 apartments that belong to stock-listed corporations, the shareholders of which are BlackRock, Blackstone, like the usual suspects of financial capitalism. Now, to slow down and explain all these awkward legal terms. So, socialization, the German word for it is Vergesellschaftung, is a unique legal term that has its own article or its own clause in the German constitution, and that allows to deprivatize certain kind of resources, to transfer certain kind of crucial resources such as land or natural resources or means of production from private to public ownership, but only under the proviso that this would also be democratically managed. This is important to highlight because we're not talking nationalization here. This is something very different. It's democratically owned commons. So the idea is both public ownership and distributed participatory democratic management. And the history of this clause is very, very interesting because, it dates back to the German Revolution, and then it was picked up to the Constitution of the Weimar Republic. And then in 1949, as the new constitution was written, this was, of course, very particular time because Germany just emerged out of the darkness of Nazism. And one of the objectives that the legislators have, throughout the whole constitution was how to make sure that no kind of power can be misused again to destroy democracy. And when I say no kind of power, that indeed specifically include economic power. There was a clear...
That's the experience from the Nazis, that the business elites were supporting the Nazi coup against the German then democracy, which is kind of almost what we see happening today. If you look at the US with Trump and so on, we see the big business supporting almost like a coup against democracy. And you, with all these right-wing movements in Germany now, you can also see that this misuse of economic power is also creating a divide in a society. So it's very interesting that you're highlighting this little article, or this very important article. Sorry, continue.
It's all about democratic checks and balances, right? It should be simple. It shouldn't be that surprising that any kind of power can be used for a good purpose or can be misused, right? Like the political power can be used to make a democratic community, or it can be used to turn a community into authoritarianism, right? Economic power can be used to distribute goods and resources to the people, or can be used to extract value and take it away from the people, and that has always been the case. But the innovation of German constitution is indeed that this potential misuse of economic power has its counterpart in this clause that allows people to curb this economic power, because it's certain kinds of checks and balances as standard of liberal democracy, right? That we have a separation of the courts from the government and so on and so on. So we have this division of power into three, and but the unique added value and the real innovation in this sense, the legal and political innovation that arose with the German Grundgesetz, the constitution written in 1949, was a clear recognition that economic power belongs to power as all the other powers, and therefore we need to watch and be a watchdog for this power as well. Something that in the age of global cooperation, again, shouldn't be a surprise either.
It's kind of amazing, Leilani, this clause written in 1949 that is now can be used. And I really love the idea and the story that you tell in your book, that the activists found this never used part of the constitution, saying, hey, this is a way we can fight back. And that's must be very close to your way of seeing how you can use law, isn't it, Leilani?
It is. I mean, the story is unbelievable to me. Like the idea that there sits this constitutional provision never having been used. Such a powerful provision. I'm not a constitutional scholar. I don't know constitutions from around the world. I know a few constitutions. I've never come across an article like that that foresees foresaw actually the abuse of economic power and tried to deal with it through a principle of democracy. I mean, it's pretty wild. And then this story you tell, Joanna, of I think you say that you're at home breastfeeding your daughter or you're falling asleep, et cetera, and you miss some kind of a party or an event where a bunch of people were saying we should use this provision. And the idea of, I mean, it's throughout your book, and it seems to be throughout the actual campaign for this socialization, this interplay between having fun and partying and joyfulness, and then anger and fighting and using the law. I loved that story. So, I mean, the idea of using this unused article to protect people is just, it's amazing. I can't say that I've done that in my work because I've never come across a legal principle that hadn't already been used.
But then you build a movement around this, and the movement's name is basically named after the biggest housing company who owns 240,000 apartments in Germany. And you said, and the movement says we should bring those apartments back to this kind of new body. And then there was this referendum, and over 60% of the Berliners voted yes. And now then, where are we? What is happening now? Because it's 4 years ago now. So what is happening? What is cooking?
What is cooking? It's 3 years ago, and we're working. I mean, I think one thing that I find amazing about Berlin's initiative, Deutsche Wohnen und Co. enteignen, which means expropriate Deutsche Wohnen and Co. And Deutsche Wohnen is the name of one of those several big corporations, is its persistence. And just speaking to what you just said, Leilani, the persistence that comes from the refusal to separate politics from laws, from emotional life of a human being. And I think, we have a way of pretending that, I think especially actually the liberal side loves this illusion that politics is or should be all rational. And it never was, and to be honest, it never should be. And coming back to where the Article 15 came from, why this constitution is so innovative? Well, to be honest, because of grief. Because it's always easier to value what we've lost. And by all means, in 1949, the Germans really knew very well what does it mean to lose democracy, to lose human rights, to lose dignity. And from there come this creative force. This question that was asked again and again, how can we make sure this will never happen again? And this is a creativity that arises from pain and from grief. And that's part of it. And the same, if you look at history, all political progressive change for the better has the component of anger. Because in order to want to change something, you need to realize that the way things are is not just. And of course, that makes you angry. Now, the alchemy of the movement is to address and name and embrace this anger, but then to transform it into joyful action. Because as important as anger is never enough, because it's a very burning emotion, right? It's a reaction, it's in the end, it's a reactive emotion. So you need to transform it into something constructive, but you definitely need to name it and embrace it. And again, if we look at the rise of right-wing populism, nowadays, of course, it's an effect of the fact that the liberal mainstream refuses to acknowledge and see people being angry. for what the system has done to them. And if no one addresses this anger, then it gets captured by right-wing mobilization. It's been like that in the Nazi Germany. And we can observe it unfortunately, in many different contexts. And therefore, I think that the importance of this mobilization in Berlin goes far beyond the housing market, as much as I think housing market is super important, because it provides, in a way, a new model of making popular politics that is honest to the emotion, that doesn't misuse the emotion in order to cynically manipulate them and redirect them towards the weakest, be it the migrants, the refugees, name it, right? But just really does the hard work of working with it. And it is a hard work. And for that, you need the anger, but you also need the joy. You're not going to get hard work done if you don't give yourself also this moment of celebrating what we are actually fighting for, because what we are fighting for is freedom and joy of being able to realize yourself in the city, to become who you want to be, together with others, not individualistically, but together.
I like that part of your writing also, when you says that emotions are an integral part of our rationality. I mean, we have the right to be emotional, because it's also about life. But Joanna, just quickly back to, because I understand that you win, then it starts a long process. So where is this process now at the moment? Just to understand it.
Yeah, all the emotion distracted me, of course, from the process. Yes, so what's happening now is we keep working. And a year ago, the second anniversary of the referendum, where it was very clear that the government is not intending to implement the democratic decision of its own people, the movement announced a crowdfunding campaign. And we crowdfunded, I think, around 100,000 euros. And ordered a legal firm, a very renowned firm, a professional legal firm specialized in public law, to write a legislation for us that we're going to put towards a second referendum. So, and at the moment, the firm is working on this legislation. Of course, it is better to err on the side of caution, and it needs to take as long as it needs to take, because the worst possible result would be to have this some sort of formal mistake in this legislation, and then the referendum, let's say, has a positive result, but the whole thing falls through. I mean, that's I write about this a lot, right? Like, law thrives of these technicalities, and in a way, it is like a logical quest how to make sure that it all aligns with legal technicalities. And for that purpose, I mean, the movement has its own version of a legislation proposition, which we wrote already during the first campaign. And of course, it becomes the basis. But to err on the side of caution, we work with very professional lawyers who will write this legislation for us. And then, in a way, the whole game starts anew. We start collecting signatures. And just as you enjoyed celebrating the first referendum, we invite you up front to the second election evening, Fredrik and Leilani. And let's hope we're going to win again. And then, if we win the legislative referendum, then it would be automatically implemented. So as a short explanation, I mean, in Berlin law, there are two kinds of referenda possible. One is this legislative referendum, which we will be organizing now, and the other referendum basically orders government. It's more of a political referendum. I mean, it shows that there is a very clear support for a certain cause, but it would have been the job of the government to legislate it, which in a way is logical, because it's generally the job of the government to provide legislation. But of course, the downside of it is that if the government resists and refuses, there is no legal way of forcing it. I mean, if someone doesn't want to do it, then they wouldn't want to do it. Now, the funny, like, in-between development was that after the mayor of Berlin that was elected the same day that the referendum happened, Franziska Giffey, who is no longer mayor, but she was very clear that she doesn't want to do it, and she started a commission that would investigate the legal possibilities, if it would be legally viable. And it was very clear it's a delay move, and in a way she's hoping that the commission says it's not possible. The setup of the commission was so that they're on their side, chose very conservative lawyers, and yet the commission very clearly, after months and months of proceeding, produce a report that clearly confirms that our proposition is legally viable.
You are listening to Pushback Talks, Have an idea for the show? Send us a message. You can reach us at info@maketheshift.com or film@wgfilm.com. Now back to the show.
You say something in your book that Leilani told me before. That's like very interesting. People make rights meaningful, and that's why in a democracy, law cannot be left only to lawyers. I like that kind of conclusion that the law is that important, so don't leave it to lawyers. We have to kind of use the law as a tool ourselves. And we did an episode here actually about South Africa, why South Africa was so active in the International Court of Justice regarding Palestine, because they used the courts as a battleground in the fight against apartheid. So there is a deep tradition of using law as a tool in a struggle. I just take it out to the wider global scape again. Push, the film that features Leilani, talks very much about the financial crisis in 2008, which then led to, in the end, to this kind of financialization of homes all around the world. Blackstone entered into the game in 2012 and became suddenly the biggest landlord on the planet. It kind of shifted really quick. And in your book, you have a very sweet story about the apartment you live in Berlin. You lived there for 18 years and you've been in court several times against your landlord. But then you also make a differentiation between the private owner and the public hold company. Can you tell us about that experience and that conclusion?
Mm-hmm. Of course, yes. So, I mean, that's one way in which I became politicized, to the politics of housing market in Berlin in particular, was through my own legal struggles. Because, when I first came to Berlin from Warsaw, I was also amazed by the freedom that the well-functioning housing market allowed me and other people as individuals to really take risks and go for what we want in our life, right? Rather than worrying about taking mortgage credit and not being able to find an apartment at all. And then at some point it tipped and it started getting tighter and tighter. And yes, on the individual level, I mean, when the gentrification started properly in Berlin, our landlord, back then I was sharing my apartment with other students, he tried to get rid of us, basically, in many different ways. And it turns out that actually it's not that easy. I mean, we were dutifully paying rents. We're not damaging any apartment. We were perfect tenants in this respect. And it turned out that actually tenant rights, it's a very interesting moment. I mean, I can imagine, especially the Anglo-American world, it's very counterintuitive. But the German Constitutional Court decided that tenant rights are actually property rights, which means as a tenant, I also have property rights to my apartment. Now, property rights is something different than ownership in the civil code. I mean, of course, in terms of simple ownership, the apartment belongs to my landlord. He can sell it and get full money of it. I cannot sell it, right? But my use rights as a tenant are property rights in that they realize the human right to property. Because the human right to property is not about speculating with something on the financial market. It is about having this stable base that allows freedom, right? I mean, that's the liberal, not just German Kantian, because if you look at the writings of John Locke, it's actually very similar. I mean, the whole idea why in the Western world the notion of property became so important was not because it made people wealthy, but it was because in this basic sense, if you have a stable base for living, it becomes a base for your freedom. And that was the original purpose of property that is actually misappropriated by this financial speculation. So in a counterintuitive way from today's perspective, but in a philosophically very coherent way, our movement is actually not against property, it's for property, but against speculation.
And you're against the misuse of economic power,
Exactly.
Which is in your constitution, which is kind of very interesting. But you also put the difference between a private owner and a public hold company, because what we've seen is that the public hold companies, this anonymous money, yes, that flows in and takes over, which is the separation between a tenant and the owner is like, it's it's bigger than ever.
Yes. I mean, yes, because they have completely different purposes. So first, the landlord, my landlord is actually a human being, and a corporation is not. I mean, that's one subtle difference, which is good to start. But the other difference is that, a regular landlord, a person who, let's say, owns 2 buildings, operates on the housing market. As a tenant, I'm his client, effectively, right? And there is a certain symbiosis between us because he needs me because I pay rent, right? And I need him because he provides me housing. Now, a stock-listed corporation actually appears to operate on the housing market, but in reality operates on the financial market. The clients of them are not tenants, but shareholders. And the shareholders do not need housing. They need to yield return on capital. And that means that no matter what the dynamic of the housing market is, this dynamic will be completely subordinated to the purposes of the financial market. And yes, I mean, Berlin is growing and there's already demographic tension. I mean, in the sense there's not enough housing in Berlin and we're not denying it. But this is only an extra fuel. But even if there were enough apartments, I mean, the corporate landlords are known to try to save on maintenance costs and keep raising the rents, because that's the only reliable way to make sure that their shareholders get more and more profit. And in this way, I mean, the buildings that were built to house people tend to just dead storages of someone else's capital. And when I say someone else's, again, often it's also not people. I mean, the shareholders of corporations are often another corporations. And most of them are registered somewhere very, very far away from Berlin. I mean, in fact, Deutsche Wohnen and Vonovia, none of the large shareholders are based in Berlin or even in Germany. I mean, they are the BlackRocks, the Blackstones, the Norwegian pension fund, and so on and so on. So the value that is being collectively produced in the city is being extracted and scattered somewhere in remote places, and the people of Berlin have nothing of it.
Leilani, this sounds like the story we've been working on. It seems like Joanna are on the same page, or we are on the same page as Joanna, and we can turn it around many times. But I think we have an understanding of something.
I think your I think your book really demonstrates so lovely the difference between the individual private landlord versus the publicly held company. Just, I mean, even though you end up fighting your landlord through legal means, there's a relationship there. And that is not the way it works when a corporation that's publicly held owns your building. You say this, and I want our listeners to hear it. You say, although corporate landlords operate within the Berlin housing system, structurally, they belong to a completely different system, the global financial system. And that, to me, just really clarifies exactly what's going on. They look like they're part of the housing system, but really they are part of something quite other. And I also liked in your book the way you use the built environment to show that, the beautiful old Bauhaus architecture that was apartments that were built for living. And the new way that these actors build when they build, because they don't all build, they're often just purchasing. But when they build, what are they doing? They're maximizing dollars per square meter. And so you get these ugly boxes to live in that don't have any of that sense of like, this is meant for life, I think that's something that doesn't get talked about a lot, about the way in which when these corporate actors are saying, oh, we're going to solve the housing crisis, there's a deficit of units, we're going to build. What are they building? And what do we lose when they start building?
What is happening now in Sweden, the kind of the lobby group of the business world, they're proposing to build apartments without kitchens because it's kind of expensive to build a kitchen. And then the guy says, you can buy so many restaurant lunches for that cost of a kitchen. It's really arrogant, as the builder would then put money to the tenant to go to restaurants. Of course not. But this is how arrogant they are becoming. They have a good self-confidence right now, the bastards. So, sorry the language. I said bastard. I could say much worse words than that. You know I can.
Yes.
But what I like with your work and the Berlin work is this kind of idea of radical politics as a way of deepening the democracy and also renewing the rule of law, which is like, and a lot of left-wing movements would say, fuck the system, fuck the law. But you actually say, save the system with the law, or change it. It's like, it's kind of, in some way, you're not outsiders, you're insiders, which is kind of, I guess, sometimes problematic in Berlin, where you have a lot of people who define themselves as totally outside the system.
Well, yeah, but life is full of paradoxes, and to be honest, I think it's really not either or. And I think what I like about the movement, again, that it's both anti-systemic and pro-systemic at the same time. Because what does it mean? I agree, the system does not need to be destroyed. The system is being destroyed by these financial speculations, and it needs to be saved. However, the way that the system operates now is by privileging the financial interests over human interests, and that part of the system does need to be questioned and destroyed. Only not by violence, but by the legal violence. Again, I quote Benjamin. Law is a means of violence too. It's one of the means of violence, right? The Benjamin speaks of the mythical violence of the law, because it doesn't occur through physical violence, but it's a way of enforcing things, by all means.
This is an inspirational chat we have, Leilani, because I think what the Berlin experience gives us is some hope and new directions. And I think that's really inspiring, because a lot of people out there are, struggling in the dark in some way. And maybe the German constitution have some extra clauses that opens up something, but I think we all have constitutions that we could use and laws, because we opened this podcast with a quote from Saskia Sassen, who said that, the people with power, they have more lawyers than us. And that's how they've been able to round models and protection systems built in our societies. Sweden is a country with a lot of protection for tenants and for workers and so on. But I can see that they found the loopholes, and around, when the lawmakers were writing the law, they didn't know, they couldn't see these loopholes. But these lawyers, they do, and they find ways to trash the law. So it's also about closing down these loopholes and giving the law back to the initial meaning, how it was written. Can you say it like that, Leilani? I'm not a lawyer.
No, but I like what you said, because I think, especially right at the end, I think if you write legislation from a place that isn't completely observant and understanding of a movement like DWE that we're talking about, then you end up with legislation that will have loopholes. And it's not about closing loopholes. It's about writing legislation that is from the right place at the outset. Because they will always find loopholes if we just try to plug this one and we plug this one, and then they'll find another one. Because when law is of the system and the system is corrupt and not of the people, then we're always going to end up with imperfect law. But when law is written from the right place, and that's what I think Joanna is saying they're trying to do right now. They wrote the first draft of the legislation, and that's being used as a basis for the lawyers now to move forward with it. It will be better law than if it's just written by the people who are part of a system that's working for them.
Yeah, I think that's one thing I'm trying to say is also to undo this division between the law and the people. In the end, the law is an important means of democracy. And democracy presumably is a system that gives power to the people. And therefore, law is also something that belongs to the people. And a beautiful thing about DWE is, again, it doesn't only reclaim apartments, it also reclaims the law as something that we use to realize freedom and democracy. You know, one of the metaphor I'm working with is this Jungian notion of shadow and of what we suppress. Because again, the liberal notion of the rule of law is always that there's absolutely that the ideal law is that there's absolutely no politics in the law. Now, this is completely not true. There's no such thing as, to start with, the legislation is written by people, it's written in certain periods with certain people in power. So of course, each written law has its own political history. And then there is a politics of how this law is being interpreted and how this law is being enforced. And that's on each of this moment, changes the law. So the idea is not to pretend that the law must be perfectly apolitical. It's more to make this politics transparent. Because if it's not transparent, if we pretend that there's no politics of the law, then it ends up being only the politics of the powerful that discreetly impacts the law. Whereas it should be the politics of everyone. It should be democracy. Democracy means power to the people. And if we stick to this means that also the legal debate needs to be conducted in collaboration between legal experts and the general public.
Wow, so this is like a shout out to all legal students and to all lawyers around the world and to all activists. Unite and check the law and try to make it work for the people. I think it's interesting. Leilani, you might have many friends out there. I think you already have, but there's more, and you also, Joanna. So we will put up your book because it's on Cambridge Press and it can be read for free.
Yes. So my book is commons too, just like the housing would be. And anyone can access it for free.
So we will put it up in the info of this podcast, so you can read. We can also put up a link to your movement so people can read more, because I think you also have English information, don't you?
Yes,
because
we do.
So Berlin is such an international city, which is loved and not loved. But anyway, friends, I think we are all running away to new tasks in life because we are busy people. But wow, I'm really happy that we could make this. Thank you, Joanna, for taking part in Pushback Talks. And Leilani, always, the love is in the air. It's far from Malmo to Ottawa, but it's we always meet, which I like a lot.
We do.
And good luck with your works. And for you, the listeners of Pushback Talks, please rate us, tell your friends, tweet about us if you're still on Twitter or in your other social media. So tell your friends about it and subscribe to the podcast, because that's also a way of supporting it. Leilani, any final words?
Yeah, I want to shout out to our listeners to read Joanna's book, because we didn't talk too much about it, but it also is instructive about movements. And we are in a moment in history where movements are happening everywhere. People are on the streets everywhere with their anger, and Joanna's book is instructive. So, and one other thing. If you want to support our podcast, because we have zero funding for it, you can go to patreon.com and look for Pushback Talks and give us €1 or $2. That'll help, right, Fredrik?
Yeah, and you can watch my film, Breaking Social, which is also about movements. Breaking
right.
Social, go to the website breakingsocial.com and you can find a way to watch the film. Because there was somebody of our listeners who asked if we're going to show the film in Canada. Which might happen, but you can see it online already now. So go and watch it. Ciao, and enjoy the late summer.
Thank you.
Yes. Thanks, Joanna. Bye, Fredrik.
Thank you so much. Have a lovely day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Pushback Talks is produced by WG Film. To support the podcast, become a patron by going to patreon.com/pushbacktalks. Follow us on social media at make_the_shift and push_the_film. Or check out our websites, maketheshift.org, pushthefilm.com, or breakingsocialfilm.com.